What if a queen's greatest power was not her crown, but the secrets she kept? What if the choice of a prayer book could seal a political alliance, or the cut of a dress could signal a rebellion? We picture the queens of Spain's golden age as rigid figures in dark dresses, their lives dictated by childbirth and prayer. But what if that image was a carefully constructed mask? What if a queen who endured 10 pregnancies and saw only 3 children survive was not just a tragic figure, but a political operator who used her very suffering to gain influence? How could a woman, legally possessing almost no formal authority, come to control armies, treasuries, and the fate of an empire? They were prisoners in golden cages, but some found ways to pick the lock. Number 17. How did a queen's household become a shadow government? The queen's household staff sometimes numbered over 500 individuals. The annual budget for the household of Mariana of Austria in the 1670s exceeded the entire budget for Spain's Council of War. A position as a lady-in-waiting, a menina, was often more sought after by noble families than a high-ranking military commission for their sons. The official head of the queen's household, the Camera Mayor, could become one of the most powerful people in the entire kingdom, rivaling even the king's chief minister. The Spanish court was a world of suffocating etiquette. Every action was prescribed. But within this rigid system, the queen's personal household operated as a separate sphere of influence. It was not just a collection of servants, it was a complex hierarchical organization that the queen controlled directly. And this control gave her immense unstated power. The king had his government, his councils, his ministers. The queen had her household. And in the shadowy corridors of the Alcazar Palace in Madrid, her household often mattered more. The power started with access. The queen's household controlled the physical space around her and, by extension, the king's private life. The king and queen of Spain lived in separate but connected apartments. To get to the king in his private moments, you often had to go through the queen's sphere. The ladies-in-waiting, the chamberlains, the pages, they were the gatekeepers. They saw who came and went. They heard the whispers, they knew who was in favor and who was not. A nobleman seeking a royal grant or an ambassador wanting a private word with the king might find his official requests bogged down in bureaucracy. But if his wife was a friend of the queen's Camarera Mayor, a path could be cleared. A word from a lady-in-waiting, passed to the queen over needlework, could achieve what a month of formal petitions could not. And Mariana of Austria, the second wife of Philip IV, and later regent for her son Charles II, was a master of this game. Her household was her political base. She appointed people to positions within it, not just for their skills, but for their loyalty and their family connections across Spain and Europe. Her Camarera Mayor was not merely a head servant, she was Mariana's chief of staff, intelligence chief, and political whip. Through this network, Mariana gathered information. She knew about plots among the grandees. She knew which ministers were secretly in debt. She knew about the king's private anxieties. This information was currency, and she spent it wisely to protect her interests and the interests of her son. The household was also a machine for dispensing patronage. This was perhaps its most important function. The queen had hundreds of positions at her disposal, from high-ranking ladies of the chamber to pages, doctors, chaplains, and even tradespeople who supplied the royal apartments. Securing one of these posts for a son, daughter, or cousin was a major goal for noble families. It meant a salary, prestige, and proximity to power. The queen decided who got these jobs. In doing so, she created a vast network of loyalty. Families who owed their position to the queen were bound to support her in court politics. If a rival minister tried to move against her, he would find that dozens of other influential families, all tied to the queen's household, would stand in his way. Look at Elizabeth of Valois, the third wife of Philip II. She arrived in Spain as a young teenager, a French princess in a stern and unfamiliar court. Her French household was immediately a source of suspicion, but she quickly learned to use it. She carefully integrated Spanish nobles into her service, balancing them with her French retainers. Her household became a bridge between the two cultures and a place where she could exert her own influence, softening the harsh edges of Philip's court and promoting her own people. Her ability to manage this delicate ecosystem earned her respect and a quiet authority that belied her youth. This power was hidden in plain sight. On the surface, the household was about domesticity, it was about managing the queen's wardrobe, meals, and religious observance. But in reality, it was a political nerve center. It was a place where alliances were forged, information was traded, and careers were made or broken. It had its own budget, its own hierarchy, and its own, culture of loyalty. When the king's government was paralyzed by factional infighting, the queen's household could often act with speed and decisiveness. It was, in effect, a parallel administration, one that answered not to the councils of state, but directly to the queen herself. And in the closed world of the Spanish court, that made it a formidable instrument of power. Number 16, could a queen's letters change the course of a war? A Spanish queen in the 17th century might write over 1,000 personal letters in a single year. These letters, sent to her family in Vienna, Paris, or Munich, were not checked by the king's ministers. The diplomatic pouch of a queen's brother, an archduke, was often considered more secure for sensitive information than the official Spanish diplomatic service. A single line in a letter from Queen Mariana of Austria to her brother Emperor Leopold I in 1673 helped delay a peace treaty with France, directly altering the military calculations of the Franco-Dutch War. The queens of the Spanish Golden Age were almost all foreigners. They were Austrian archduchesses, French princesses, or Portuguese infantas. They came to Spain as part of a dynastic bargain meant to produce heirs and bind nations together, but they never truly left their old homes behind. They maintained a constant, voluminous correspondence with their families' fathers, mothers, and especially brothers who were now kings and emperors in their own right. This correspondence was their private lifeline. It was also a powerful political tool. Official diplomacy was a slow, formal process. Ambassadors exchanged carefully worded notes. Councils debated for weeks, but a letter from a queen to her brother was direct and personal. It bypassed the entire state apparatus. While the Spanish Council of State was debating a policy towards the Holy Roman Empire, the Queen, Mariana of Austria, was already writing to her brother, the Emperor, in Vienna. She could share information that the Spanish ambassadors might not have. She could tell him what the king was really thinking, what anxieties he expressed in the privacy of their chambers. She could warn him about which Spanish ministers were hostile to Austrian interests and which could be trusted. This was back channel diplomacy of the highest order. This was not just gossip. It was strategic communication. Queens used their letters to advocate for specific policies. Margaret of Austria, wife of Philip III, was a staunch supporter of the Austrian Habsburgs. Through her letters to her family in Graz and Vienna, she constantly pushed for a more pro-Austrian foreign policy in Madrid. She argued for sending Spanish money and troops to support her relatives in the growing conflicts in Germany that would eventually become the 30 Years' War. The king's chief minister, the Duke of Lerma, was often hesitant, preferring to avoid expensive foreign entanglements. But Margaret's constant pressure, both in person and through her letters, which created a second front of diplomatic pressure from Vienna, often swayed the king. Her correspondence created a feedback loop where her family in Austria would use the information she provided to shape their own diplomatic approaches to Madrid, reinforcing the very arguments she was making in person. These letters were also a source of vital intelligence. The network of couriers who carried the Queen's private mail was often faster and more reliable than the official state post. A queen could learn about a military setback or a new political alliance in Paris days or even weeks before the Spanish government did. Elizabeth of France, the first wife of Philip IV, maintained a close correspondence with her brother, King Louis of France. Even as Spain and France were becoming bitter rivals, their personal link remained. She used it to try and mediate, to soften the blows, and to gain insight into French intentions. She could understand the personalities at the French court in a way no Spanish ambassador ever could. She knew her brother's moods, his insecurities, and the influence of his own ministers like Cardinal Richelieu. This psychological insight was a priceless strategic asset. Of course, this was a dangerous game. A queen's loyalty was always implicitly suspect. Was she a Spanish queen or an Austrian archduchess? By maintaining these private diplomatic channels, she risked being seen as a foreign agent, a spy in the palace. Her enemies at court, rival ministers, or ambitious nobles could use her correspondence against her. They could accuse her of leaking state secrets or of putting her birth family's interests ahead of Spain's. That is why the letters were often written in a mix of formal language and private code, full of allusions and shared family memories that only the recipient could fully understand. The line between family news and state secret was deliberately blurred, but for these isolated, powerful women, it was a risk worth taking. Their letters were their connection to home, their source of information, and one of the few tools they had to shape the grand strategies of the continent from within the confines of their royal apartments. Number 15 was religious piety, a political weapon. Queen Margaret of Austria, wife of Philip III, personally funded the foundation of 6 major convents and monasteries. Her personal confessor, a Franciscan friar named Luis de Aliaga, was later appointed to the Council of State, one of the highest governing bodies in Spain. In 1668, Queen Regent Mariana of Austria used her public acts of devotion and a network of influential churchmen to help orchestrate the political exile of her son's popular illegitimate half-brother, Don Juan José de Austria. A queen's choice of who to pray with could be as politically significant as a king's choice of who to go to war with. You know, in the deeply Catholic world of Habsburg Spain, religion was not separate from politics, it was the language of politics. Piety was the ultimate source of legitimacy, and for a queen whose formal political power was almost non-existent, a reputation for holiness was a formidable asset. It gave her a moral authority that no minister or general could claim. It allowed her to criticize, to influence, and to act in ways that would otherwise be seen as an unacceptable overreach of her role. A queen's piety was a very public performance. Her attendance at Mass, her participation in religious processions, her charitable works, her endowment of convents, all of it was closely watched by the court and the country. A queen who was seen as genuinely devout earned the respect of the people and the clergy. This created a reservoir of goodwill that could be drawn upon for political purposes. Margaret of Austria was a master of this. She was intensely, genuinely religious, but she was also politically shrewd. She understood that her piety gave her a platform. She could frame her political goals in religious terms. For example, her desire to oust the corrupt chief minister, the Duke of Lerma, was not presented as a personal power struggle. Instead, she and her allies framed it as a moral crusade to cleanse the court and restore godly governance to the kingdom. Her reputation for sanctity made this argument credible and powerful. The Queen's confessor was a key figure in this dynamic. He was her spiritual guide, the man to whom she confessed her sins. But he was also her private advisor, her confidant, and her political operative. The bond between a queen and her confessor was incredibly close. In the isolated world of the court, he was often the one person she could speak to with complete honesty. A politically astute queen would choose her confessor carefully. He was her link to the powerful machinery of the church. Through him, she could influence clerical appointments, direct church resources, and gather information from the vast network of priests and religious orders across the empire. Queen Mariana of Austria's relationship with her Jesuit confessor Johann Eberhard Nithard is the most extreme example. When she became regent for her young son, Charles II, she appointed Nithard to be her chief minister and inquisitor general. It was a stunning move. A foreign priest was now effectively running the Spanish Empire. It was a disaster in many ways, as Nithard was not a skilled politician and was deeply resented by the Spanish grandees. But it demonstrates the immense trust a queen placed in her confessor and her willingness to use her religious authority to grant him secular power. Founding convents was another key strategy. This was not just an act of charity. A convent was a strategic asset. When a queen founded a convent, like the famous Convent of the Royal Barefoot Franciscans Descalzos Reals in Madrid, she became its patron. She had the right to appoint the abbess in influence who was admitted. These convents often became homes for the unmarried or widowed female relatives of the nobility. They became centers of female power and influence, loyal to their royal patron. The women inside were not cut off from the world. They received visitors, exchanged letters, and remained part of their powerful family networks. A convent founded by the queen was a listening post, a place to park her allies, and a symbol of her piety and influence that would last for centuries. Elizabeth of Valois, wife of Philip II, used her patronage of the Descalzes Reals to build her network of support among the Spanish noblewomen who entered the convent or supported it, helping her solidify her position in a court that was initially alien to her. For these queens, a cross was as mighty as a sword, and a prayer could be more effective than a decree. Number 14, how could commissioning a painting secure a border? In 1625, Elizabeth of France, Queen of Spain, helped arrange the commission for Peter Paul Rubens, the most famous painter in Europe, to produce a series of tapestries. The project was not just about art. It brought Rubens to the court, where he acted as a secret diplomatic envoy for the Spanish Netherlands, directly influencing Philip IV's policies toward England and France. The placement of a queen's portrait in a specific room of the palace could signal a shift in political favor, a message read instantly by every courtier. The famous painting Las Meninas by Velázquez is not just a portrait of the Infanta Margarita, it is a complex statement about the queen's role and the future of the dynasty, with Queen Mariana of Austria and King Philip IV reflected in the back mirror, the ultimate controllers of the scene. The art in the Spanish Golden Age was not just decoration, it was propaganda. It was a visual language of power, legitimacy, and succession. And queens were central to this visual culture. While they could not sign treaties or lead armies, they could and did commission, influence, and control the creation of art. Through their patronage of painters like Velázquez, Rubens, and Claudio Coelho, they shaped the public image of the monarchy and sent sophisticated political messages to a select and powerful audience. A queen's primary role was to produce an heir. Her body was a vessel of the state. Art was one way to manage the intense pressure and political stakes of this role. Portraits of the queen were not simply likenesses, they were political documents. A portrait showing the queen in good health, richly dressed, and looking serene was a statement of dynastic stability. When a queen became pregnant, the court artist would get to work. A portrait of a pregnant queen was a powerful message of hope and continuity. Conversely, when an heir died, as happened so often, the art changed. The queen would be painted in mourning, her piety emphasized, a visual representation of the kingdom's grief and her own resilience. Mariana of Austria was a master of the political image. After her husband Philip IV died, she became regent. She was a woman ruling a deeply patriarchal society. She used art to legitimize her rule. She had herself painted by court artists in a widow's habit, a severe and modest form of dress. This was a brilliant political move. The image was not one of weakness or grief, it was an image of piety, sobriety, and moral authority. It signaled that she was not a frivolous woman seeking personal power, but a devout widow fulfilling her sacred duty to her son and the kingdom. The image disarmed potential critics. How could one attack a ruler who presented herself with such humility and religious devotion? The widow's weeds became her political uniform. Queens also used their patronage to advance the careers of their favored courtiers and ministers and to build alliances. By selecting a certain artist, a queen could elevate his status and by extension the status of his other patrons. When a queen commissioned a series of paintings for her private chapel or a new altarpiece for a convent she supported, the contracts and jobs involved created a web of obligation. The nobles who helped facilitate the project, the artists who got the work, the clergy who received the art, they all became part of the queen's network. The subjects of the art were also carefully chosen. A queen might commission a series of paintings depicting heroic female saints, subtly drawing a parallel between their virtues and her own. Saint Elizabeth of Hungary, known for her charity, was a favorite subject. By associating herself with such figures, a queen could build her public persona. Elizabeth of Valois, known for her gentle nature, was often associated with saints, known for their peacemaking abilities. It was a form of branding, creating an image that could be a real political asset. The art collections of the queens themselves were also a form of power. Their queens brought art with them as part of their dowries, and continued to collect throughout their lives. Their private galleries were not just for pleasure. They were spaces where politics happened. To be invited to view the Queen's new acquisitions was a sign of high favor. Important conversations could take place in front of a painting of a mythological or historical scene, with the artwork itself providing a subtle commentary on the topic at hand. A discussion about a potential military alliance could take place in front of a painting of David and Goliath, the message hanging silently in the air. In this way, the Queen's art collection became another tool in her arsenal, a way to communicate, to persuade, and to project an aura of culture, power, and divine right. Number 13, was the Regency the only time a queen could rule? When King Philip IV died in 1665, his will named his wife Mariana of Austria as the regent for their 3-year-old son Charles II. For the next 10 years, she was the legal absolute ruler of the Spanish Empire. During her regency, she personally approved military budgets, appointed viceroys to Peru and Mexico, and negotiated the treaty that recognized the independence of Portugal. This was not hidden power. It was open supreme authority, but it was an authority she was only granted because she was the mother of a male child who had outlived his father. The Regency was the one exception to the rule that a woman could not rule Spain in her own right. The fundamental law of the land was salic, meaning the crown had to pass to a male. A daughter could inherit only if there were no sons, but the throne would then pass to her husband. A queen consort, the wife of a king, had no constitutional power at all. But if the king died and left a son who was too young to rule, the Queen Mother was the natural choice for regent. This period of regency was a window of immense opportunity, a time when a queen's power was no longer hidden but absolute. Mariana of Austria's regency is the most significant example from the Golden Age. She took power at a moment of profound crisis. Her Spain was exhausted from decades of war, the treasury was empty, and the new king, Charles II, was a frail and sickly child whom many expected to die. The nobility was factious and hungry for power. Mariana, an Austrian princess who had always been seen as an outsider, was now in charge of it all. Many expected her to fail, to be a mere figurehead manipulated by powerful nobles. They were wrong. She ruled with an iron will. She established a small governing council, or junta, to advise her, but the final decisions were hers. She understood that her primary duty was to preserve the throne for her son. This meant she had to be ruthless. Her greatest challenge came from Don Juan José de Austria, Philip IV, charismatic and popular illegitimate son. He saw himself as the natural leader of Spain and had a huge following among the people and the army. He was a direct threat to Mariana and her son Charles. Mariana outmaneuvered him for a decade. She used all the tools at her disposal. She used her control of the state to keep him in military commands far from Madrid. She used her network of spies to monitor his activities. She used her religious authority to paint him as ambitious and disloyal. She managed to keep him from seizing power until 1677, long after her official regency had ended. It was a masterclass in political survival. Another powerful regent was Maria Cristina of Austria, though she ruled later in the late 19th century. Her experience shows the continuity of this form of power. But within the Golden Age, Mariana's predecessor, Elizabeth of France, wife of Philip IV, also tasted this power, albeit briefly. During the Catalan Revolt in the 1640s, Philip IV had to leave Madrid to command his armies in person. He appointed Elizabeth as regent. In his absence, she acquitted herself brilliantly. She worked tirelessly to raise money and troops for the war effort, mortgaging her own jewels to pay soldiers. She proved to be a capable and decisive administrator, earning the respect of the ministers who had initially been skeptical of her. The regency, however, was a double-edged sword. A queen's power was entirely dependent on the life of her young son. If you were to die, her authority would evaporate instantly. The crown would pass to the next male heir, and she would be reduced to the status of a dowager queen, expected to retire to a convent. This made the health of the young king the single most important issue of the state. Every cough, every fever sent shockwaves through the court. A regent queen lived in a state of constant anxiety. Furthermore, a female regent was always seen as unnatural by some. She faced constant resentment from the powerful grandees who believed that a woman had no place in government. They often conspired against her, seeing her rule as a temporary inconvenience before they could take power themselves. A queen regent had to be constantly vigilant, playing factions off against each other, using patronage to shore up her support, and using propaganda to legitimize her rule. The regency was the moment a queen stepped from the shadows into the full glare of sovereign power. It was a position of immense authority, but also one of profound vulnerability. It was the ultimate test of her political skill. Number 12. How did raising a prince shape an empire? The education of the heir to the throne. The Prince of Asturias was a matter of state. His tutors were chosen by the king and his councils. But the child spent the first 7 years of his life exclusively in the care of his mother and her household. And Queen Margaret of Austria personally selected the nurses, governesses, and companions for her son, the future Philip IV. She dictated his daily routine, his prayers, and the stories he was told. The values she instilled in him during these formative years, a deep piety and a sense of solemn duty, would shape his entire reign. The most fundamental duty of a queen was to provide a male heir, but her influence did not end at childbirth. The queen was the primary influence on the future king during his earliest, most impressionable years. While the formal curriculum of academic subjects and statecraft would be handled by men chosen by the king, the queen shaped the boy's character. She taught him his prayers. She taught him how to behave at court. She chose his playmates from among the children of the nobility, an early and subtle act of patronage. The bonds formed in the royal nursery between the prince and these other children could last a lifetime, shaping the political landscape a generation later. This was a subtle but profound form of power. The queen could instill in her son a particular worldview. Margaret of Austria, a deeply devout Austrian Habsburg, made sure her son Philip grew up with a powerful sense of his duty to defend the Catholic faith and the interests of the wider Habsburg family. This was not an abstract lesson. It was part of his daily life, reinforced through prayer and the stories of his ancestors. When Philip IV became king, his policies, particularly his commitment to the catastrophic 30 Years' War, were a direct reflection of the values his mother had taught him. He saw himself not just as the King of Spain, but as the leader of Catholic Europe, a role his mother had prepared him for since birth. The queen could also use her influence over her son to shape his relationships with the powerful figures at court. She could teach him whom to trust and whom to be wary of. She could ensure that the people she favored had access to the young prince, building a bond of affection and loyalty. Conversely, she could subtly poison his mind against her rivals. This was a long-term political strategy. A minister who slighted the queen might find, a decade later, that the new king was inexplicably hostile towards him, the seeds of that hostility having been planted years before in the nursery. Consider the case of Elizabeth of France and her son Balthasar Charles. He was a bright and promising heir, and Philip IV's great hope. And Elizabeth doted on him and was a constant presence in his life. She managed his public appearances, his clothing, and his image. The famous portraits of the young prince by Velázquez were produced under her supervision. They show a confident, healthy-looking boy, an image designed to project dynastic security. She was not just raising a son, she was curating the image of the next king. His tragic death at the age of 16 was a personal heartbreak for her, but also a political catastrophe that plunged the court back into a succession crisis. Her role as the shaper of the future king was suddenly gone. The queen also controlled the female side of her son's world. She chose the ladies-in-waiting and servants who attended him. This created a bubble of influence around the prince that was loyal to her. The information that reached him, the gossip he heard, the very atmosphere he grew up in, were all filtered through her and her household. This was particularly important in the rigid Spanish court, where the prince's life was highly circumscribed. This power was, of course, limited. Once the prince reached the age of about 7, his formal education was handed over to a governor, a male noble appointed by the king. And from that point on, the mother's direct influence waned. But the foundations of his character were already laid. The lessons learned at his mother's knee, the loyalties and antipathies he developed in his early childhood, would remain with him. The queen's role as educator was not in teaching her son Latin or military strategy. It was in teaching him how to be a king in the Habsburg mold. It was a power that played out not in the council chambers of today, but in the policies and decisions of the reign to come. Number 11. Could a queen's knowledge of the king's health topple a minister? King Philip IV suffered from severe bouts of depression, what the court called melancholy. His wife, Queen Elizabeth of France, was one of the few people who knew the true extent of his illness and could manage his moods. Her ability to choose the right moment to approach him with a petition or a political request when he was in a better state of mind gave her a significant advantage over ministers who might face the king at the wrong time. The king's health, physical and mental, was a state secret, and the queen was its primary keeper. The king was the center of the Spanish system of government. His personal well-being was directly tied to the well-being of the state, but the king was also a human being, subject to illness, stress, and weakness. The queen, as his wife, was the person who knew his physical and emotional state most intimately. She shared his bed. She saw him at his most vulnerable. This intimate knowledge was a source of great power, though it had to be used with extreme subtlety. First, the queen controlled information about the king's health. In an age of uncertain succession, any sign of royal illness could destabilize the kingdom. It could encourage foreign rivals, embolden domestic factions, and cause panic in the financial markets. The queen and the royal physicians had to manage the public perception of the king's health carefully. They would issue vague, reassuring statements even when the situation was dire. This ability to control the flow of information was crucial. A queen could downplay an illness to maintain stability, or she could strategically leak information about the king's poor health to achieve a political goal. For example, to delay an unwelcome decision, or to undermine a minister who was pushing for a policy she opposed. "The king is not well enough to consider this now" was a powerful phrase, and the queen was often the one who determined when it was true. Second, the queen's role as the king's primary caregiver gave her unparalleled access and influence. When the king was ill, he was isolated from his ministers. The council chambers were quiet, but the queen was there, in the royal bedchamber. She was the one who brought him his broth, who read to him, who comforted him. In these moments of weakness, a king might be more open to his wife's suggestions, more willing to listen to her advice, free from the formal pressures of the court. Margaret of Austria was said to have used the time of Philip III's frequent illnesses to press her case against the Duke of Lerma. She could speak to the king as a concerned wife, framing her political advice as a desire to lessen his burdens and protect him from corrupt advisors. It was an argument a minister could not easily counter. This was especially true for mental health. The pressures on a Habsburg king were immense. Philip IV, for example, presided over a period of imperial decline and constant warfare. He was prone to periods of deep melancholy and religious guilt, and Elizabeth of France learned how to navigate his mood. She knew when to leave him alone, when to distract him with a court entertainment, and when to broach a serious subject. The ministers and courtiers who did not have this intimate knowledge could easily misstep, approaching the king with a request at the wrong moment and earning his anger. The queen, by acting as a gatekeeper and a mediator, could effectively control the political business of the court, advancing her allies' petitions and stalling those of her rivals, all under the guise of protecting her husband's health. The final, most dramatic instance of this power came at the end of the king's life. As the king lay dying, the queen was at the center of the storm. She, along with the royal confessor, controlled access to the monarch. The final decisions of the reign, the composition of the Regency Council, the last-minute grants of titles and lands, the confirmation of the will and world, were made in these last hours. A queen who kept her composure could exert enormous influence over these final acts, shaping the political landscape for years to come. When Philip IV was on his deathbed, Mariana of Austria was there. She ensured that his will confirmed her as the sole regent, cutting out her rival, Don Juan José de Austria. Her control of the sick room at that critical moment guaranteed her hold on power for the next decade. In the Spanish court, knowledge of the king's humors, fevers, and sorrows was not a private matter. It was a vital tool of statecraft. Number 10. How did arranging a marriage for a lady-in-waiting secure an alliance? In 1615, Queen Elizabeth of France, wife of Philip IV, played a crucial role in arranging the marriage between her trusted lady-in-waiting, the Marquesa de la Hinojosa, and the son of a powerful grandee who was aligned with a rival court faction. The marriage brought the family into the Queen's orbit, shifting the balance of power within the court. This was not an official state treaty, but a personal, social arrangement. Yet, its political consequences were just as real. A queen's official role in dynastic politics was clear. She was a piece in the game of international marriage alliances. Her own marriage sealed a treaty. The marriages of her children would be her main contribution to foreign policy. But beyond these grand matches, a queen wielded a more subtle and personal power as a matchmaker within her own court. The Spanish nobility was a closed, interconnected world. Marriage was the primary way to consolidate wealth, titles, and political influence. And the queen was often at the center of this marriage market. Her power stemmed from her position as the head of her own household. Her ladies-in-waiting, the damas and meninas, were the daughters of the highest-ranking noble families in Spain. They were sent to court at a young age to serve the queen, but also to be educated and, most importantly, to find a suitable husband. They were the most desirable brides in the kingdom, and the queen had significant influence over who they married. A queen could use this influence in several ways. She could reward her allies by promoting a match between one of her ladies and the son of a loyal family. This was a major prize. A family whose son married one of the queen's ladies gained prestige and, more importantly, a permanent connection to the inner circle of the court. The young bride would maintain her relationship with the queen, providing her family with a direct line of communication and influence. Over time, a queen could build a powerful faction of loyal families, all bound to her through the marriages she had sponsored. Conversely, she could block a marriage that she felt was politically disadvantageous. If two powerful families who were part of a rival faction sought to unite their houses through marriage, the queen could intervene. If the intended bride was one of her ladies, the queen could simply refuse her permission or her blessing. She could declare the match unsuitable. It was very difficult for a noble family to go against the express wishes of the queen in such a personal matter. By preventing such alliances, she could keep her rivals divided and weak. The queen also acted as a mediator and broker. Noble families would approach her, seeking her help in arranging a match for their children. She knew the eligible young men and women at court better than anyone. She knew their family's financial situations and their political leanings. She could suggest potential matches that served her own political interests. For example, she might suggest a marriage between a wealthy but less prestigious family and a family with a great title but little money. The resulting alliance would be grateful to the queen for making the match, creating another bond of loyalty. Elizabeth of France was particularly adept at this. She arrived at the Spanish court as a young French princess and had to build her own base of support. She did this in part by taking a keen interest in the lives and futures of her ladies-in-waiting. She fostered a sense of community and loyalty within her household. Her sponsorship of their marriages was not just a political calculation, it was often born of genuine affection. But the result was the same. She created a network of noblewomen scattered across the great houses of Spain who felt a personal loyalty to her. This network was a source of information and support that was invaluable in the faction-ridden court of Philip IV. This power was deeply personal and operated entirely outside the formal structures of government. It was based on social custom, personal relationships, and the queen's unique position as the female head of the court. A minister could not order a marriage alliance between two noble families, but a queen could make it happen over a cup of chocolate. It was another example of how the queens of the Spanish Golden Age used the tools available to them, the social and the domestic, to achieve very real political ends. They were not just playing matchmaker, they were weaving a web of power, one marriage at a time. Number 9 was a queen's private plea, a form of veto power. In 1622, the powerful Count Duke of Olivares, Philip IV, chief minister, proposed a series of drastic new taxes that were deeply unpopular with both the nobles and the common people. The councils had approved the plan. The king was ready to sign. But Queen Elizabeth of France made a personal appeal to her husband in the privacy of their chambers. She argued that the taxes would cause unrest and damage his reputation with his subjects. Philip IV, moved by her plea, ordered Olivares to reconsider and modify the plan. The queen had no formal power to veto a law, but her personal intervention acted as one. The Spanish king was an absolute monarch. In theory, his word was law, but in practice, his decisions were influenced by a host of advisors, councils, and powerful figures. The queen was the advisor with the most intimate access. While a minister had to schedule a formal audience, the queen could speak with the king at any time ever over dinner, while walking in the gardens, or in the middle of the night. This proximity gave her a unique opportunity to influence policy at the final moment, after all the official debates were over. This power of the pillow talk veto was one of the most effective and most hidden tools a queen possessed. It depended entirely on the personal relationship between the king and queen. A queen who was respected and loved by her husband had enormous influence. A queen who was disregarded did not. It was a power based on emotion, trust, and intimacy, not on legal right. The queens would often be approached by courtiers, nobles, or even foreign ambassadors who had failed to achieve their goals through official channels. They saw the queen as a court of last resort. They would plead their case to her, hoping she would take it up with the king. A queen had to be careful. If she intervened too often, she could annoy the king or be seen as a meddler. But if she chose her moments carefully and argued her case well, she could change the course of events. Margaret of Austria, wife of Philip III, used this power effectively in her long struggle with the Duke of Lerma. Lerma controlled the government and had the king's complete trust for years. He enriched himself and his family, and many at court felt his corruption was damaging the kingdom. Margaret agreed. She could not challenge Lerma openly in the council, but she could speak to Philip III privately. She would gently point out Lerma's extravagances, question his appointments, and highlight the suffering of the common people. She framed her arguments in moral and religious terms, appealing to the king's deep piety. It was a slow, patient campaign of attrition. Each private conversation was a small drop of water on a stone. Eventually, combined with other pressures, her campaign worked. Lerma's influence began to wane, and he was eventually forced from power. The queen's private pleas had helped to topple the most powerful man in Spain. This intervention was not always about grand politics. Sometimes it was about individual cases of justice. A queen might be moved by the plight of a noble family who had been treated unfairly, or an officer who had been passed over for promotion. And she could bring the case to the king's personal attention, asking him to review it. In the bureaucratic machine of the Spanish Empire, a personal intervention from the queen could cut through red tape and deliver a swift result. This role as an intercessor, a merciful figure who could soften the harshness of the law, was an important part of a queen's public image and a source of her popularity. The risk for the queen was that she would alienate the king's ministers. A powerful minister like Olivares did not appreciate having his carefully laid plans overturned at the last minute because of the queen's intervention. It could create enormous tension between the queen and the king's government. Elizabeth of France had a complex relationship with Olivares. They were often rivals for the king's ear. She had to be very strategic in her disagreements, choosing her battles carefully. She knew she could not win every fight, but by asserting her influence in key moments, she reminded everyone at court, including Olivares, that her power, while informal, was very real. She was the one person who could turn the king's mind when everyone else thought a matter was already settled. Number 8, how did controlling who entered a room give a queen power over an empire? An ambassador from Venice spent 6 months in Madrid in 1645, seeking a formal audience with King Philip IV to discuss a naval treaty. His requests were repeatedly delayed by the bureaucracy. Finally, on the advice of a court insider, he secured a brief, informal conversation with Queen Elizabeth of France during a public promenade. A week later, he was granted his audience with the king. The queen had not negotiated the treaty, but she had opened the door. Literally, in the highly ritualized world of the Spanish court, physical proximity to the monarch was the ultimate measure of influence. Power was a map of rooms and corridors, who was allowed into the king's private study, who could speak to him as he walked the chapel, who was invited to the private hunts. Controlling access to the king's person was a primary source of political power. While the king's household was officially run by men, the queen and her household controlled the domestic private side of the palace. And this gave her a significant say in who got close to the king. The king and queen lived in connected but separate sets of apartments within the royal palace. The queen's apartments were a political space, and she was the gatekeeper. To be invited into the queen's chambers for a social gathering was a sign of favor. It was a place where political conversations could happen in a less formal setting. A minister, a noble, or a foreign envoy might be able to speak more freely with the king in this relaxed atmosphere, away from the rigid protocol of the council chambers. The queen decided who received these invitations. She could use them to reward her allies, giving them precious time with the king, and she could punish her rivals by excluding them, effectively cutting them off from this informal channel of influence. The queen's camera mayor, the head of her household, was a crucial partner in this process. She managed the queen's schedule and, by extension, the social life of the court. She knew who was trying to see the queen and why. A courtier seeking the king's support for a project might first approach the camera mayor. If she could be convinced of the project's merits, she might arrange for the courtier to be in the right place at the right time, perhaps to encounter the king and queen as they walked in the gardens, providing a brief opportunity to present his case. This was how much of the real business of the court was done, not in formal meetings, but in these seemingly accidental encounters, which were often carefully orchestrated by the queen and her staff. Mariana of Austria, during her time as queen consort and later as regent, was a master of controlling access. Her apartments in the Alcazar were the center of a political faction. She understood that by controlling who saw the king and later who saw her son, the young Charles II, she could control the information he received and the advice he heard. She surrounded her husband and son with people loyal to her. Ministers who were part of her faction found it easy to get an audience. Those who were in opposition found their requests for a meeting mysteriously lost or delayed. They were frozen out. In a personal monarchy where the favor of the king was everything, being denied access was a political death sentence, this power extended beyond the palace walls. The queen influenced who was invited to royal hunts, who sat in the royal box at the theater, and who participated in religious processions. Every one of these events was an opportunity for informal politics, a chance to have a word with the king. By shaping the guest list, the queen was shaping the political conversation. This gatekeeping role also made the queen a natural target for those seeking influence. Foreign ambassadors knew that befriending the queen and her ladies-in-waiting could be more effective than months of formal diplomatic overtures. They would send lavish gifts to the queen and her household, not as bribes, but as a way to gain favor and access. An ambassador who was on good terms with the queen would find his job much easier. He might receive a tip about the king's mood or a warning about a rival minister's plans. The queen was the hub of an informal information network. This was not a formal constitutional power. There was no law that said the queen was in charge of the king's schedule. It was a power that grew organically from her role as the king's wife and the mistress of the royal household. It was a soft power, but it was profoundly effective. By controlling the doors, she could influence the decisions made behind them. Number 7 was a fashion choice, a political statement. When Marie-Louise d'Orleans arrived in Spain in 1679 to marry King Charles II, she was a fashionable French princess. She was horrified by the rigid, dark, and heavy style of dress required by Spanish court etiquette, which had changed little in a century. Her attempts to introduce lighter French fabrics and styles were not just a matter of personal taste. They were seen by the traditionalist faction at court as a challenge to Spanish identity and a symbol of dangerous foreign influence. The battle over her wardrobe was a battle over the political direction of the monarchy. In a court where every gesture was scrutinized for meaning, fashion was a powerful form of non-verbal communication. For a queen who was constantly on public display but whose public speech was highly restricted, her clothing, her jewels, and her hairstyle were a way to send messages. They could signal her mood, her political allegiances, and her ambitions. What a queen wore was not a trivial matter, it was a political statement. The traditional Spanish court dress for women, the guardenfante, was a stiff bell-shaped affair, typically in black or other dark colors. It was designed to conceal the body and project an image of sobriety, piety, and formality. This style was a symbol of the traditional, austere, and deeply Catholic values of the Spanish Habsburgs. For a queen to embrace this style was to signal her acceptance of Spanish ways. For her to deviate from it was to signal a rejection of those values. Mariana of Austria, after she was widowed, adopted a severe widow's habit. As discussed, this was a brilliant piece of political branding. But even before that, as queen consort, she understood the power of dress. In her official portraits, she is always depicted in the most formal Spanish attire, reinforcing her image as a proper Habsburg queen. However, in the privacy of her rooms, she might wear more comfortable clothing or styles from her native Austria, signaling a different side of her identity to her inner circle. Queens could also use fashion to signal their dynastic origins and their connection to their families abroad. A queen might wear a jewel that was a gift from her brother, the King of France, or the Holy Roman Emperor. This was a subtle reminder to the Spanish court of her powerful foreign connections. It was a way of saying, I am not just the King of Spain's wife, I am a daughter of France, a sister of the Emperor. My family is a power to be reckoned with. When tensions were high between Spain and her home country, a queen might choose to dress in a deliberately more Spanish style to show her loyalty to her new kingdom. Conversely, to show her displeasure with a Spanish policy that harmed her family's interests, she might pointedly wear a jewel or a style associated with her homeland. Fashion could also be used to promote a political faction. A queen might favor a certain color or a particular type of lace. Soon, all the ladies at court who were part of her faction would begin to wear the same style. It became a kind of uniform, a visual way of showing allegiance. A courtier could see at a glance who was in the queen's circle. Elizabeth of France, with her more refined French tastes, subtly influenced the court away from the most extreme rigidity of the earlier era. She promoted certain craftsmen and merchants, and her patronage could make or break their careers. This economic power was another side of her control over fashion. The arrival of a new foreign queen often brought a fashion clash that mirrored the political tensions of the moment. The Spanish court was deeply xenophobic. A new queen was always viewed with suspicion. Her clothing was one of the first things to be criticized. Marie-Louise d'Orleans, a niece of Louis XIV, arrived at the height of French power and Spanish decline. Her elegant French gowns were seen as a symbol of French arrogance and frivolity. The traditionalist party at court insisted she adopt the rigid Spanish style immediately. Her struggle to maintain some of her own fashion identity was part of a larger struggle to maintain her personal and political autonomy in a hostile environment. For these queens, the wardrobe was a battlefield. Every choice of fabric, color, and cut was a political move. Number 6. How could a queen's private fortune fund a war? Queen Elizabeth of France received an annual income from her own estates and dowry lands that amounted to over 100,000 ducats. While the Spanish state was frequently bankrupt, the queen's personal treasury was often solvent. During the Catalan revolt in the 1640s, when the king's government was unable to raise funds to pay the army, Elizabeth pawned her personal collection of jewels, raising tens of thousands of ducats to provision the troops. She was acting not as queen, but as the monarchy's emergency banker. While a queen's legal rights were limited, she was not without her own financial resources. A queen consort had a right to a queen's household budget, a substantial sum meant to cover the expenses of her household, wardrobe, and charities. But, more importantly, she often controlled her own private purse. This wealth came from several sources: the income from the lands and properties that were part of her dowry, gifts from her family abroad, and her own private investments. This financial independence gave a queen a degree of autonomy and a powerful tool of influence. First, this money allowed her to be a major source of patronage, independent of the king. She could use her funds to support her favorite artists, to endow the convents and monasteries she favored, and to give gifts and pensions to her allies at court. This created a network of people who were financially beholden to her, not to the king or his ministers. A courtier who was in debt might discreetly approach the queen for a loan. A religious order seeking funds for a new building would petition her. By dispensing this largesse, a queen built up a huge reservoir of goodwill and obligation. Margaret of Austria was known for her immense charitable and religious spending. She poured her personal fortune into her religious foundations. While this was an expression of her genuine piety, it was also a political investment. The monasteries and convents she funded became centers of her influence, and her reputation for generosity enhanced her moral authority at court. She was seen as a virtuous and selfless queen, which gave her criticism of the corrupt Duke of Lerma more weight. Second, the queen's private wealth could be used in times of national emergency. The Spanish state, despite the vast silver revenues from the Americas, was in a state of perpetual financial crisis. It was often unable to pay its soldiers, supply its fleets, or fund its wars. In these moments, the queen's personal fortune could be a vital strategic reserve. As mentioned, Elizabeth of France repeatedly used her own money and jewels to support the war effort during her regency. This was a powerful political act. It demonstrated her loyalty and commitment to Spain in a very tangible way, silencing critics who might have seen her as a foreigner. It also created a debt of gratitude from the king and his government. She had stepped in to save the day when they had failed. This gave her enormous political capital, which she could spend later when she wanted to influence a policy or promote a candidate for office. The management of the queen's finances was a major operation. She had her own treasurer and administrators who managed her estates and investments. This gave her an independent bureaucracy loyal to her. A position in the queen's financial administration was a highly sought-after job. It provided opportunities for a clever administrator to enrich himself, but it also required absolute loyalty to the queen. Mariana of Austria managed her own finances very shrewdly. She understood that money was power. During her long widowhood and regency, her personal wealth gave her a degree of security and independence. Even when her political enemies controlled the king's government, they could not touch her personal fortune. This allowed her to continue to support her allies, fund her intelligence network, and maintain her own parallel court. She could afford to play a long game, knowing she had the resources to wait out her opponents. This private wealth was a crucial element of a queen's hidden power. In a world where she was legally dependent on her husband, having her own money gave her a measure of freedom. It allowed her to act independently, to build her own networks, and to intervene at critical moments. The queen's jewel box was not just a collection of ornaments, it was a state treasury in miniature. Number 5. Did the queen lead a faction at court? The court of Philip III was dominated by two opposing factions. One was led by the king's chief minister, the Duke of Lerma. The other, a network of reform-minded nobles and clergy, coalesced around Queen Margaret of Austria. The queen's faction met in her private apartments, used her confessor as a go-between, and worked for years to undermine Lerma's influence. His eventual fall from power in 1618 was a direct result of the pressure campaign orchestrated by the Queen's party. The Spanish court was not a monolithic entity. It was a snake pit of competing factions, families, and individuals all vying for the king's favor, which was the source of all wealth and power. In this environment, a queen could not afford to be neutral. She had to have her own party, her own faction, to protect her interests, promote her allies, and fight her enemies. The leadership of a successful court faction was one of the most important ways a queen could wield power. A queen was the natural leader for certain groups at court. Dissatisfied nobles who felt they had been excluded from power by the king's chief minister would often gravitate towards the queen. They saw her as an alternative center of power, a potential route back to influence. Foreign ambassadors and courtiers from the queen's home country also naturally looked to her as their patron and protector. Religious figures and reformers who were concerned about the moral tone of the court often saw a pious queen as their champion. The Queen's faction operated in the shadows. It did not hold formal meetings. Its members were bound by informal ties of loyalty, family, and shared interest. The Queen's apartments were the nerve center. Her ladies-in-waiting were the communication network. Her confessor was often the chief strategist. The goal of the Queen's faction was simple: to place its members in key positions in the government, the church, and the royal households, and to remove members of rival factions. The struggle between Queen Margaret of Austria and the Duke of Lerma is a classic example. Lerma and his family had a stranglehold on the government. Margaret believed he was corrupt and his policies were ruinous. She began to quietly build a coalition against him. She promoted men she trusted, like her confessor Luis de Aliaga, and supported nobles who had been sidelined by Lerma. Her faction worked to expose Lerma's financial misdeeds and to persuade the pious Philip III that the Duke's rule was an offense against God. It was a long, slow, and dangerous process. Lerma fought back, trying to isolate the Queen and place his own spies in her household. But in the end, the Queen's faction prevailed. Mariana of Austria also led a powerful faction during her regency, which became known as the Partido de la Reina, the Queen's Party. This faction was built around her and her key advisors, like her confessor Nithard. Its primary opponent was the faction led by her illegitimate stepson, Don Juan José de Austria. The politics of Spain for over a decade was defined by the struggle between these two groups. The Queen's Party controlled the central government in Madrid, while Don Juan José's faction had its power base in the army and in regions like Aragon and Catalonia. Mariana used all the tools of a faction leader. She dispensed patronage to her supporters. She used propaganda to discredit her enemies, and she formed strategic alliances with powerful nobles to keep her rival at bay. Leading a faction was risky. It meant making enemies. A queen who became too powerful, a factional leader could be accused of dividing the court and usurping the king's authority. Elizabeth of France, wife of Philip IV, had to tread a very fine line. The king's minister, the Count Duke of Olivares, was all-powerful. He did not tolerate rivals. Elizabeth could not lead an open faction against him. Instead, she created a more subtle network of friends and allies, a social circle that also functioned as a quiet political caucus. She did not seek to overthrow Olivares, but to create a counterweight to his influence, a space where alternative ideas could be discussed, and where those who had fallen out with the minister could find a safe haven. For a queen, leading a faction was a necessity for political survival. She arrived in Spain as a stranger, often with only a small retinue of her own people. She had to build her own base of support. By gathering a party around her, she could protect herself, advance her agenda, and transform her position from that of a ceremonial figurehead into a true political player. Number 4, why was a queen's pardon more powerful than a judge's verdict? A nobleman was convicted of treason by one of Spain's highest courts in the 1630s and sentenced to death. His family, having exhausted all legal appeals, made a final plea to the Queen, Elizabeth of France. She was moved by their case, and choosing a moment when the king was in a good mood, she fell to her knees before him and begged for the man's life. Philip IV, reluctant to deny his wife such a dramatic and public plea for mercy, commuted the sentence to exile. The Queen had not overturned the court's verdict, but she had overridden its sentence. One of the traditional roles of a monarch is to be the fount of justice, to have the power to show mercy and grant pardons. In Spain, while the king held this power legally, the Queen often acted as the chief intercessor, the primary advocate for mercy at court. This was a role that fit well with the Catholic image of the Virgin Mary as the merciful intercessor for humanity. A queen who was seen as compassionate and willing to plead for the unfortunate could gain immense popularity and a powerful form of moral authority. This power of intercession operated on many levels. On a daily basis, the Queen would be deluged with petitions. These were not just from high-ranking nobles, but from people of all social classes. A soldier's widow might ask for a small pension. A merchant might ask for help with a legal dispute. A minor official might ask for a promotion. The Queen had a staff that would sort through these petitions. For the most compelling cases, she would take them up herself. She might pass a request to the relevant minister with her personal recommendation, which carried great weight. Or, for the most serious cases, she would speak directly to the king. This role made the queen a safety valve for the pressures of the rigid Spanish legal and bureaucratic system. When the system produced a result that seemed unjust or overly harsh, the queen was a final court of appeal, one based not on law but on grace. This was an incredibly powerful position. It meant that people all over the empire saw the queen as a potential savior, a figure of hope. Of course, a queen had to be strategic in her use of this power. She could not champion every case that came before her. She had to choose her interventions for maximum effect. Pleading for a member of a powerful and loyal family was a way to cement that family's allegiance to the crown. Granting a pardon in a case that had attracted public sympathy was a way to generate popular goodwill for the monarchy. Elizabeth of Valois, the young wife of the stern Philip II, was particularly known for her gentle and merciful nature. She often acted as a softener of her husband's harsh policies, and her intercessions were credited with saving several people from the king's wrath. This made her beloved by the people and gave her a quiet influence that even the king's powerful ministers had to respect. The act of pleading for a pardon was often a piece of public theater. A queen would not just have a quiet word with the king. She might make her plea at a public event or stage a dramatic scene like falling to her knees. This was not just for the king's benefit. It was a performance for the entire court. It demonstrated the queen's compassion and her influence. It was a reminder to everyone that even when the official channels were closed, there was still a path to the king's mercy, and it ran through the queen. This power was not without its dangers. A powerful minister might resent the queen for interfering with the course of justice, especially if she secured a pardon for one of his political enemies. And if the king refused her plea, it could be a major public humiliation, a sign of her waning influence. But for the most skillful queens, the role of intercessor was one of their most effective weapons. It cost her nothing financially. It enhanced her public image as a pious and merciful mother to her people, and it gave her the power to change a person's life, or to save it with a single, well-chosen word to the king. Number 3, how could the way a queen stood in a ceremony weaken a duke? At the formal court reception for a new ambassador, the ceremonial protocol dictated that the Queen, Mariana of Austria, should stand 2 paces to the king's left. The king's chief minister was to stand 3 paces behind the king. On one occasion in 1670, the queen subtly shifted her position, standing slightly forward and closer to the king. This small change meant that the ambassador had to address her more directly, and she engaged him in a brief conversation before the king spoke. The entire court saw the move. It was a silent public declaration that her influence was on the rise and the minister's was, perhaps, on the wane. A court ceremony in Habsburg Spain was not just about pomp and tradition, it was a precise, symbolic language that communicated the political hierarchy. Every detail, who stood where, who walked in what order, who was allowed to sit in the queen's presence, who handed the king his gloves, was laden with meaning. For a queen who was at the center of this ritualized world, her role in these ceremonies was a major source of her power and status. By understanding and manipulating this symbolic language, she could assert her authority in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. The queen was the highest-ranking woman in the kingdom, and the ceremonies of the court were designed to constantly reinforce this fact. In public processions, she would walk or be carried in a position of supreme honor. At state banquets, she sat next to the king. In the royal chapel, she had her own privileged space. This constant, ritualized display of her status was not just for show. It had a real political effect. It reminded every noble, every minister, and every foreign ambassador of her importance. It was harder to dismiss or ignore a person who was so clearly elevated by the weight of tradition and protocol. A queen could use her role in these ceremonies to reward her friends and punish her enemies. The invitation to a private court event hosted by the queen, like a concert or a play in her apartments, was a coveted sign of favor. To be excluded was a public snub. The queen could also influence the ceremonial roles assigned to others. For example, the honor of being one of the ladies who attended the queen during a major religious festival was highly sought after by noble families. The queen's choice was a public statement about which families were in her favor. She could also use protocol as a weapon. If a nobleman or an ambassador slighted her, she could retaliate through ceremony. She might fail to meet his eye during a reception. She might turn her back on him at a crucial moment. In the hyper-aware environment of the court, these small gestures were like a slap in the face. They would be noted by everyone and would damage the person standing. Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the French wife of Charles II, found the Spanish etiquette suffocating, but she learned to use it. When she was displeased with the powerful Cardinal Portocarrero, she used ceremonial protocol to signal her displeasure, refusing him the small customary honors he was used to receiving from her, a subtle but effective campaign of disrespect that undermined his authority. The birth and baptism of a royal infant were among the most important ceremonies of the court, and the Queen was at the center of them. The entire event was a piece of political theater designed to celebrate the continuity of the dynasty. The Queen's role as the mother of the heir was paramount. The choice of godparents for the child was a major political decision, often used to seal an alliance with a foreign power or a powerful noble family. The Queen had a major say in this choice. The ceremonies surrounding a royal birth elevated the Queen to the status of a semi-divine figure, the vessel of the dynasty's future. Even in mourning, ceremony was power. When a king died, the Queen led the public mourning. Her demeanor, her dress, her piety, all were carefully watched. As we saw with Mariana of Austria, the widow's weeds could become a political uniform, a symbol of her right to rule as regent. The funeral ceremonies were a transition of power, and the Queen Mother's central role in them helped to legitimize her new position as the guardian of the new, young king. For the queens of the Spanish Golden Age, the stage of the court was their primary field of action. They may not have written the script, but they were masters of performance, able to steal a scene and shape the plot with a gesture, a glance, or a well-timed shift in position. Number 2, did a queen's foreign family act as her spies and bankers? When Mariana of Austria was struggling in her regency against her rival, Don Juan José de Austria, she was short on cash and political allies within Spain. She wrote a series of desperate letters to her brother, Emperor Leopold I, in Vienna. In response, he arranged for his bankers, the Fugger family, to extend a secret line of credit to her. He also instructed his ambassador in Madrid to act as her personal political advisor and to use the entire weight of the Holy Roman Empire's diplomatic network to support her rule. Her family was not just a source of comfort, they were her foreign legion. We have discussed the Queen's letters. But the impact of her foreign connections went far beyond correspondence. As a foreign princess, a Spanish queen was never just an individual. She was the living embodiment of a dynastic alliance. She was her family's permanent representative at the Spanish court. This position gave her access to a network of resources, political, financial, and intelligency that was completely outside the control of the Spanish government. The Queen's family abroad provided her with a constant stream of information. The ambassador from her home country was not just a representative to the Spanish king, he was also, in effect, the Queen's man. He would meet with her privately, sharing intelligence that he would not share with the Spanish ministers. He would report back to her family on the political situation in Madrid, including his assessment of the Queen's own position and security. This gave the Queen a perspective on events that was different from the one she got from the Spanish court. She had her own private foreign intelligence service. This network was also crucial for her personal security. A Spanish queen was always in a precarious position. If her husband died without an heir, or if she fell out of favor, she could be cast aside, perhaps forced into a convent. Her family back home was her ultimate protection. The Spanish court knew that they could not mistreat a French princess or an Austrian archduchess without risking the wrath of her powerful brother or father. This gave the Queen a shield that no Spanish noblewoman possessed. Her foreign status, while a source of suspicion, was also a source of strength. The financial connection was also vital. We saw how Leopold, I helped his sister Mariana. This was not an isolated incident. A queen's family could provide her with funds in an emergency, giving her the resources to outmaneuver her domestic rivals. Her dowry was often a complex financial instrument, with payments spread out over years, and the ongoing negotiations over these payments kept her family and the Spanish court in constant contact, giving her leverage. Furthermore, the Queen acted as a patron and protector for a community of her countrymen in Spain. Merchants, artists, priests, and soldiers from her home country would look to her as their leader. This foreign community could be a valuable asset. They were a source of loyal servants for her household, and they could provide her with information from the city and the ports that she might not get from the cloistered world of the palace. Elizabeth of France, for example, maintained a network of French contacts in Madrid who kept her informed of events in her homeland. This foreign connection was, of course, the primary reason for a queen's political vulnerability. Her enemies would always accuse her of being a foreigner at heart, of putting the interests of her birth family before the interests of Spain. The Spanishness of a queen was a constant political issue. To be successful, a queen had to perform a difficult balancing act. She had to publicly demonstrate her complete loyalty to Spain while privately using her foreign connections to enhance her power and security within it. The most skillful queens, like Margaret of Austria and Mariana of Austria, were able to do this. They leveraged their Habsburg family connections not against Spain, but in a way that they could argue served the greater global interests of the entire Habsburg dynasty, both its Spanish and Austrian branches. Their foreignness was not a liability they had to overcome. It was their primary political asset. Number 1, what was the ultimate source of a queen's power? Of the 11 children born to King Philip III and Queen Margaret of Austria, only 4 survived to adulthood. Queen Elizabeth of France, wife of Philip IV, endured 7 pregnancies, but only one of her children, a daughter, outlived her. The constant cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and infant death was the central brutal reality of a queen's life. But her ability to endure this cycle and to ultimately produce a healthy male heir who survived was the foundation of all her other powers. The ultimate non-negotiable duty of a Spanish queen was succession. She was brought to Spain for one primary purpose: to give birth to a legitimate son to continue the dynasty. If she succeeded, her position was secure. If she failed, she was a political failure, and her position, and even her life, could be at risk. This biological reality was the bedrock upon which all of her hidden powers were built. Her ability to survive childbirth and for her child to survive infancy was her greatest and most fundamental power. The political stakes of a royal pregnancy were immense. As soon as a queen was known to be pregnant, the entire court held its breath. The health of the queen became a matter of state. Special prayers were offered across the kingdom. The queen herself was placed in a kind of protective custody, her diet and activities strictly monitored. A successful pregnancy was a victory not just for the queen, but for the entire kingdom, promising stability and a secure future. A queen who was pregnant with a potential heir saw her political influence soar. The king would be more attentive to her wishes. Ministers would treat her with greater respect. Her allies at court would be emboldened. She was, for those 9 months, the most important person in the country. A clever queen could use this period of heightened status to advance her agenda, to secure positions for her allies, and to sideline her rivals. If she gave birth to a healthy son, her position was transformed. She was no longer just the king's wife. She was the mother of the future king. This gave her a new and permanent status. Her political survival was now linked to the survival of her son. She had a personal stake in the future of the kingdom that was second to none. This gave her a moral authority to speak on political matters. She was not just meddling, she was protecting her son's inheritance. This was the justification used by both Margaret of Austria and Mariana of Austria for their deep involvement in politics. Conversely, the failure to produce an heir, or the death of an heir, was a political catastrophe for a queen. It was seen as a personal failing, sometimes even as a sign of divine displeasure. A childless queen was in a desperately vulnerable position. Her husband might be pressured to have the marriage annulled so he could marry someone else. This was the fate of Philip IV's great uncle, King Henry IV of France, who set aside his first wife for barrenness. The fear of this fate haunted every childless queen. Marie-Louise d'Orléans, the first wife of the impotent Charles II, lived in a state of constant public humiliation and political irrelevance because she could not conceive. Her failure to do her one essential job rendered her powerless. So, while we have explored the 17 subtle and ingenious ways that queens wielded hidden power through their households, their letters, their piety, their art, all of it rested on this one brutal biological fact. The queen's body was an instrument of state. Her ability to survive the ordeal of constant pregnancy and childbirth in a pre-modern age was a feat of endurance. Her ability to produce a son who also survived was the key that unlocked the door to all other forms of influence. It was the source of her legitimacy, the basis of her security, and the ultimate argument for her right to a voice in the affairs of the kingdom. The most powerful thing a queen could do was to give the kingdom a king. It was her first, her last, and her most important victory.